Welcome back to another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. I am James Yost, partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Travis York, owner of 3-1 Advisors. Travis, how are you?
I'm doing great today, James. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Welcome back to another episode of the Vet Worthwhile podcast. My name is James Yost. Travis, it's a very exciting week for us. The UGA Bulldogs are only a few days away from playing in their their back-to-back national championship. So I'm excited. I hope you're excited. What are we doing today? Who are we talking to?
I guess first and foremost, I'll just go along with the flow. I live in Georgia and excited, but that one's a little bit outside of my realm. But we can all be excited because we do have a UGA Bulldog here with us today, Jeff Sanford.
Go Dogs.
Yeah, buddy.
So, just kind of quick background on Jeff. Jeff, you and I have known each other for quite a while at this point in time.
15 years at least.
There you go.
Jeff is the director of financial literacy and practice outreach at UGA, which just gives him incredible insight because he spends a good portion of his time with the students, along with a lot of time in hospitals around Atlanta and really around the country with current practice owners. In addition to that, Jeff, I think you're a pretty in-demand speaker on key topics in the veterinary space, including employment, overall industry perceptions, as well as the transaction market. So excited to have you here and let you drop a little bit of knowledge, Jeff.
Excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
There we go. Love it. So let's dive right in. Travis touched on this. Part of Jeff's expertise is looking in the employment market for veterinarians. So, Jeff, give us an idea of just the overall employment market, not only for veterinarians, but also for hospital owners as well.
So it's interesting. I've been teaching at the vet school since 2002. Back then, veterinarians were falling off trees, right? I've actually had, during the last recession, I actually had some of my students taking jobs as kennel workers just so they can get a job in a practice.
Wow.
Today, it is so different. In fact, I would say that many of my students are getting offers their second year in school. And why not? 98% of them are going to pass NAVLE. So if you're a betting man, then that would be pretty good odds.
So what's more aggressive, UGA's recruiting and signing 8th graders or veterinary hospitals recruiting your veterinary students?
I look at what happens with sports, right? And they start recruiting pretty early.
Yeah, so that's right.
No, so obviously, the demand has grown incrementally for veterinarians. What are you seeing and hearing, and do you get any sense of what's going on with the support staff market, right, Jeff?
Both for veterinarians and for support staff, I probably get 3 calls a day asking, how do I recruit? How do I get people? And what we're finding is job postings tend to not work. There are some recruiters, can we say names on here?
Sure, go ahead.
Like Indeed and things like that do pretty good with staff recruiting. And we are seeing higher pay to get those staff in, not quite like the pay you're seeing in the offers with veterinarians, which you're seeing signing bonuses of anywhere between $20,000 and $250,000.
So, you said people are reaching out to you for insight into what to do to recruit people. Our listeners probably, maybe we'll just keep your phone from ringing, let you share with everybody what is your insight, or how are you guiding current hospital owners into what's important to the students and what's important? Because you maintain a relationship with many of your past graduates, right? Right. I'll talk to somebody who graduated 10 years ago and they'll say, well, that's great that you told me that, Travis, but I'm going to call Jeff and make sure you're right.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. My students, what's interesting about students is I consider them like Olympic champions, right? They go, and ever since they were young, they wanted to be a veterinarian. And in Georgia, especially with Hope, in high school, they focus on their studies and tend not to work because they're trying to get the scholarships to get into schools. They get into the schools, they try to maintain their 3.8 Zell Miller scholarship, so they study even more. Mm-hmm. And then when they get into vet school, they study more, so they keep their grades out there. So you've got like an Olympian who's just training since a very young age. And then when they actually graduate, they're good test takers, but that's not how they're going to be evaluated when they get out. So there is this idea that there's almost like an imposter syndrome when the students go out. So one of the biggest things they're looking for is that onboarding. I think mentoring is an overused word these days, and it's lip service, right?
I'm glad to hear you say that, Jeff, because I hear everybody again, if you were going to say mentorship, my follow-up question is going to be, what are the specifics, right? Like, what are the specific things inside of mentorship that are important?
Mentorship fails because there's no leadership there. There's no plan or direction for it. And there's no one to dedicate their time toward it. And therefore it fails. The people who do the best with mentorship actually back off their production and mentor that new graduate.
For better growth long-term for the entire
very much. And onboarding is proving if you onboard a person, especially not just about the medicine, but also with the leadership skills you need with your team, communication skills, and resiliency skills too. When you onboard a person like that, they're going to stay longer, they're going to be retained better, and they're going to be producing faster.
So if I heard you say something that's interesting, right? Because again, I'm just going to dig a little bit deeper, right? Is plan, right? So what I'm hearing maybe from that guidance, if I extrapolate out, is if you want to hire a doctor, actually take a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, and sit down and write out exactly what you want to teach them, what that program is. I think be very, very specific.
Exactly. I think it has to be tailored to that new person. And I think even experienced doctors need to be onboarded into new practices. For instance, if you're moving from a high volume practice to a little bit different type of medicine practice, that's going to be a shift, right? So I think culture is unique to every practice. And I think because of that, there needs to be different onboarding.
Yeah.
Very cool. And then you also talked about relationship. Expand upon that a little bit. It doesn't work I'm assuming what you mean there is it doesn't just work to say mentorship, but you actually want to have rapport with those people.
Yeah. I'll tell you a little story right quick. I was talking with a veterinarian who called me up. He just graduated this last summer and went to a practice in Florida. And what was interesting, he called me up and said, I can't believe this. They promised me mentoring and no one's talking to me. I'm only seeing 2 patients a day. And I said, did you talk to the veterinarians? They're too busy with production.
Yeah.
And they told me I need to be more efficient. And I said, how do you be more efficient with two patients? Right. And he was promised mentoring. I think especially with the corporates, I think we're seeing a lot of problems with mentoring. They think they can hire a veterinarian to be the king mentor or queen mentor. But mentoring and onboarding needs to be at a local level in the weeds. It doesn't need to be corporate position, right?
Yeah.
So
let's talk about the Mars study. So the study that Mars came up with had anticipated a shortage of veterinarians by about 15,000 in the year 2030. The big question is, are we already there? Are we close to that? And then our question for you, Jeff, is how do we solve this problem? How does this get resolved?
I do believe we're there. I just saw a data point from corporates that they're looking for there's 8,200 openings in corporate equity practices right now.
And that's just the corporates.
That's just them.
Wow.
And I talked to James Lloyd about that, who's the economist for veterinarians. And he says, yeah, you're probably about right. And if you think about corporates probably own about 35-40% of the practices, or at least the big practices, probably even more. And then I know half of the other independents are looking, at least. So based on that, in fact, I would say that because most practices don't know how to recruit and hire people or onboard people, since they can't find veterinarians and technicians, they're actually looking for corporates to dump their practices on to help them with that.
Yeah.
Which is a very bad strategy.
Hey, I know, Jeff, when we were debating many things before we started the actual recorded debate here, you talked about 2002 when you first started, and veterinarians were willing to take a position as a kennel technician just to be inside of a hospital. I can remember in 2008 sitting in a room with many of the kind of thought leaders inside of the veterinary space talking about what are we going to do over the next 7 years when there's too many veterinarians and nobody can make a living in this profession. So what's your take on what changed? How did we go from 10 years ago, we were going to have too many veterinarians and everybody was going to be giving away services for free just to stay open, to now, we don't have enough veterinarians to fill those positions?
Travis, that's a great question. In the last 5 years, this industry has changed more than I've ever seen it. I will tell you this. I think generationally, I think millennials and Zers don't see long-term, that while they might have been born a veterinarian, they don't see themselves at one place forever. And I think that's part of it. In fact, a study just came out by LinkedIn that showed that millennials and Zs have a 25% more likelihood that they're going to be in more positions over their lifetime than the Xers. So I also think that because of what happened in the pandemic, and also going back to the students they know how to do this test, but they're not being taught how to be GP doctors, right? That is up to the practices and the onboarding now. And if they're not doing that, they're going to burn them out faster because they're not going to know what to do. And a lot of times, some of these practices don't have good boundaries and they burn them out really fast. And so AVMA said right now that 40% of all veterinarians are looking at leaving.
Wow.
Which is unprecedented.
No.
What about the demand? Do you have any data on like how much the spending has changed over the last 5 to 10 years?
It's doubled in the last, I think it's the last 10 years. It went from a $50 billion industry to $100 billion in the last 10 years.
Wow.
Which is huge. So the demand is there. There's been a little bit of softening in the last quarter because the industry says that practices are down about 5%. But, I think some practices are holding back a little bit on hiring. But overall, I still think there's still a huge shortage. And I think that's just a temporary
you kind of hit
issue.
Just sitting here. Like there's almost like I'm going to put you in charge of a task force to address this, right? Because it sounds like there's these two issues going on that are almost interconnected that somebody's got to get to, right? You're really relying on practice owners or a larger corporate group to establish a mentorship program. There's only economic value in them doing that if the employee is committed to be with them for an extended period of time.
Employee or owner.
Right? And so you've got this mindset over here, like, hey, I can only offer so much mentorship if this generation of young doctors only wants to be in a certain role for 4 years. And it's like, you got to create this connection between those two pieces to start to solve, really that circle of life, right? Because you think about what veterinary medicine used to be. Why would a 41-year-old owner slow themselves up to teach a 26-year-old recent graduate? Because he or she knew that if they worked with them for 7 to 10 years, when they're 51, they step off the gas, and the 36-year-old is ready to step on the gas. And
I think if you onboard properly, a veterinarian could easily reach $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 of production fairly quickly. If you don't, they might not even reach those numbers. As far as what you're talking about, as far as time, what's interesting is if you build a practice that is built on constructs of teamwork, trust, communication, time to do your medicine, and boundaries. I think if people want to work at that practice, and if all your people are really promoting your practice to come work for, right, then you won't have a problem with this. And there's several practices that are designed that way. And I would think that now you are talking about 25-year-olds for new grads, right? So they're in transition anyway.
Right.
But overall, after 4 or 5 years, they should be settling down. And after that, they should be there long term.
Well, you hit on something, and I don't want to keep us going down this rabbit hole because we only have so much time. Right. But I'm going to put you on the spot and see if you'll commit. You said doctors can hit $600,000 to $800,000 easily with the right onboarding. So I'm just going to throw a proposal out there. Let's, in the next 3 months, commit to have you back on with an episode solely dedicated to Jeff Sanford's onboarding philosophy.
Oh, I'd love that.
Okay. Let's definitely do that. There's one other thing too I wanted to touch on that's tangential to the same conversation, which is really about non-competes, non-solicits, that kind of thing. I mean, there's a push right now in the federal government to eliminate non-competes in general, but we're also seeing, just with the labor market so tight in vet, a push to reduce non-competes, reduce the miles, reduce the timeline, all that fun stuff. Are you seeing that kind of thing? Is this something you're helping with people with? But also, part two is if you could explain to our listeners the true difference between a non-compete and a non-solicit as well.
Sure. Non-compete are just golden handcuffs, right? They just say, we're going to enslave you to this area and to this practice. Because like in Atlanta, if you have a 7-mile radius, that's all downtown. That's all in the perimeter.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to find something outside. And so I do think that from a competitive standpoint, I think you're starting to see practices either totally eliminate non-competes. California doesn't accept them, and a couple other states that don't either, right? And tell you the truth, if you have the right practice, you shouldn't have to enslave people to your practice, but with a non-compete. I mean, if you have a great practice where you're not worried about, you've got clientele that have been there for years and decades, and you don't need to worry about someone opening another practice down the street. In most cases.
Yeah. Well, let's touch on the non-solicit too. Why don't you, Travis, or one of y'all explain the difference?
So non-compete is usually, you'll see a time and timing 2-3 years usually, and also distance. If you're in a large set area, you usually see something like 3 to 5 miles. And if you're out in Montana, you might see something like 50 miles, right? A non-solicit means that if you start something, especially not too far away, you're not soliciting help or clientele.
Yeah.
And usually there's a 2-year minimum with that. And some people say directly and non-directly, or is that non-directly?
Directly and
indirectly. Thank you. Indirectly. And I don't know what indirectly means, but my guess is you can't announce on Facebook if you had a lot of clientele from the other practices and telling them that, hey, I'm starting my own practice.
Yeah, in the financial services business, which is very similar, very super strict, non-compete, non-solicits, it's funny how social media has changed that over time. Just like what you're saying, I mean, you post brand new practice, we'd love to see, and everyone's friends with you on Facebook. So, I mean, you know what I'm saying?
So you gotta be careful.
Right. Exactly.
Non-solicits do, I think, I'd love your take, Jeff, but like those do seem to have a little bit more validity, right?
Right.
I think there's
I agree. You don't want, I had one practice that lost 2 doctors and probably 4 or 5 technicians when someone opened their practice.
Directly soliciting clients, it just, if it doesn't feel right, you probably shouldn't be doing it, right?
Exactly.
You don't need a legal agreement to do that. Before we jump off of that, just for listeners, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a non-compete associated with an employment agreement and a non-compete associated with a sale? Because I think it's important to separate those two. And I don't want people to walk away from our program today and say, oh yeah, if I sell my hospital, I should have, and I get $10 million, I should have no non-compete.
Oh no, that's different. I think when you sell to corporate, you're going to get, you just got paid a bunch of money to do that. You haven't been doing like an employment. They're working for you and you're getting the benefit off of that over a period of time. And you get a big check from selling. Yeah, you need to have that non-compete. In fact, most banks probably wouldn't even loan you money or you wouldn't get that money.
And quite frankly, the value in your hospital is derived from that non-compete. So don't go objecting to that, because if you object to that, the value of your hospital may go from $10 million to $0.
And some businesses, that is the value of the practice. They'll actually say the non-compete is the value of your practice, right?
Yeah. I mean,
but from an employment standpoint, it's you're in a right to work state, it does lock you in But I would agree with you. I think over the long term, from a competitive standpoint, it doesn't make sense, especially if you're an ER practice.
Yeah.
Why would you have an ER non-compete? No,
It does not the same.
No.
So diving into this a little bit deeper, Jeff, we all obviously sit here and say, hey, there's validity to non-competes. We understand why they're there, but there's some limitations to them, and they probably overstepped some bounds, and they probably do need to be scaled back, right? There was even an FTC ruling that came out, not specific to veterinary, but yesterday around just the Federal Trade Commission's opinion on non-competes being limiting. How are you, given that we don't have that ruling, given that most of the contracts and the standard in the veterinary space is to include a non-compete? How are you guiding students that bring you an employment contract and say, I love everything about this, and you see a non-compete? What are you willing to tell them to accept?
Well, I think the first 6 months of any job, they shouldn't have a non-compete because they're new.
Yeah.
And they don't have clientele. They don't have that doesn't make sense to me. And you just want to make sure that the distance and duration is right. Now, if you go work for a corporate group, you got to be very careful that there's not a non-compete over every one of their practices that totally get you. Like I was talking to someone in Tampa, and they had 15 locations around Tampa, and they said if you work at any of those practices, you have a non-compete.
Yeah, so it's like get out of town kind of stuff.
Right. So basically that you were strapped. You couldn't do anything else in Tampa if you went to go work for that practice. If you didn't like it, you'd have to move.
So one of the things I wanted to get your take on is in your instruction, are you seeing early on, are you detecting whether a student is kind of cut out for owning their own practice one day versus someone who's just going to be a really good associate? And how are you guiding them separately in the event that you do see a difference?
So I have a belief that a good associate makes for a good owner. So if you know how to produce well as an associate, because you know how to communicate, you know how to use your team, it's just that's a micro scale, and a macro scale is a whole practice, right? So I do feel like they're kind of one and the same. So I do try to prep them first for being a good associate. And then once they hit a certain level, and I think most of the banks will only loan money if you know how to produce.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So if you want to start, now it's interesting. AMA just put out a report that recently, their economic study, which said that 35% of recent graduates under 5 years are looking at the opportunity to own. Wow. Which I think is exciting.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I love how that perspective. I've done some presentations, Jeff, where we talk about kind of the spectrum of ownership, right? And it's always kind of been either associate or sole owner. And the opportunity in the veterinary space now is immense around ownership opportunities, right? But I always start that slide with the fact that ownership starts for veterinarians as an associate, because you own what you produce. And at each scale, you're just getting to benefit more from the production and work of others.
Travis, that's a great point. I think there are so many different ways to own these days. I don't think the traditional, hey, I'm going to go work for this practice, and then I'm going to buy that practice over, 5 years, 10 years. That model is kind of gone.
Which is amazing, because that was the mold. That was 90% of the cases.
No doubt.
Only 20 years ago.
Right. I think the startups is that, and the question is, do you want to start up with your just by yourself, or do you want to join a group to help you with that? Right. I think those are the two kind of ways that people are looking.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about the hospital owner. Right. We've talked a lot about the veterinarians coming up, the employment agreements, stuff like that. But from an owner's perspective, because I know that you still are connected to a lot of the owners that you've worked with in the past, how are you helping them to make the most compelling offer to attract the best and top talent? Are there any new creative ideas that you think you could share? Because a lot of our listeners are hospital owners who are hearing this and saying, guys, you're talking a lot about the veterinarian, which is awesome. I mean, they love the industry, but how can you help me?
Exactly. I think one of the biggest things that an owner has to think about is, what are they offering to that veterinarian, or what's their promise to that veterinarian that they're hiring? I think when you look at a contract, a typical employment contract, that is all about this one will pay you. This is what you have to do to get paid, and these are all the rules. But it doesn't say, what is my promise to you as a veterinarian toward your success? And I find that is probably one of the biggest things that's missing in most of the employment, especially with independents and even corporates, is that promise. How are we going to get you where you're happy, where you feel like you're a part of a team, that you're trusted, and you have time to do the right work that you need to do?
And so our listeners just have to come back and listen when you do a full episode on building that program.
But I feel like if you build a healthy practice, that's the first thing, because you have that. So that I think that also is looking at your website, because that's where most people go first, right? And if you're looking for people, you should have an employment section. And if you're looking for people like externships, because right now, the graduates typically go work for practices. I think like 70% of them go work for practices that they have some knowledge of.
Yeah.
So I would make sure that you have externships, that you have that fresh thing.
Yeah.
I also think that if you are an old practice where you have 3 doctors over the age of 55 and you haven't done anything with your facilities in a while, it's time to freshen up and figure out how to get some new blood in that practice, because to tell you the truth, new graduates and younger people don't want to work with a whole bunch of old dudes. Right? I mean, I hate to say it that way, but that's what it is.
Yeah. What about path to partnership? Is that something that y'all talk about? Like from when somebody's coming out of vet school, like, is there an opportunity at one point to be an owner of the practice? Like, is that something that's being talked about?
Not as much as it used to. Not as much as it used to. I think some of the new corporate models are looking at that, because they're finding that there's only a limited number of practices they're going to buy. So they're looking at, who are the hot shots that can build new practices for us?
Well, I mean, I know, a lot of the things that, you talk about is the relationship and, kind of seeing where hospital owners go and their journey through ownership, and, kind of, again, on that hospital side of things, for all of our hospital owners, at some point in time, they do think about exiting the hospital. But to James's point, most of them don't exit the hospital and then leave the industry, right? Like they're here for the long term. So, I mean, I'd love to get some of your insights, Jeff, on what you've seen some of your friends that have transitioned, whether it be to an associate or to a corporate buyer, do after they've exited kind of the responsibility of ownership.
That is a great point. I think there's the short term and the long term. But most of the time when a practice sells, the owner has to stay for a year or two. What we find from a lot of the data is often those owners or partners with the corporates, they tend to be disengaged or not as engaged, which I think is detrimental. I really think that this is the time to really engage your people. I love engagement surveys. I think especially during the time that you're selling, you need to find out how people feel about your practice and make sure that you address issues of trust and basically that transition, that change, and reward your good people. I think that when you're getting this huge sum of money, they know you're getting the huge sum of money, and you pretty much did it on the backs of the people that you have in your business. So why would you not reward them? And a lot of those groups will give you money for retention bonuses. I mean, anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000 for doctors, and anywhere between $20,000 and $50,000 for your staff, so that they stay. And then it's just a matter of just being a good leader. I think what happens, though, in the long term is when that leadership leaves the practice, I think there is a vacuum of leadership. And I think that most practices haven't prepared to transition a new leader into that practice. Yeah. And that's where the weakness is. And I think that's where all this buying of practices, I think, is going to have a bit of a shuffle as leadership fails in some of these practices. In fact, I just saw an article of a practice, I think it was up in Maryland, that they had to close after 8 months because they couldn't find the people mostly because there wasn't any leadership in that practice after it was sold.
And it's got to be boots on the ground, right? It's difficult to be somebody who's zooming in, once a week to a staff meeting, right? It's got to be somebody who's in the practice. But since Travis was getting down the sales side, I think that's kind of a good segue here. So at Signature FD, our 4 pillars of wealth that we always talk about: grow, protect, give, and live. And so I figured we could talk about the give piece here. So most veterinarians throughout their career in practice ownership are giving back to they're staples in their local community. They're a part of all the different associations. They're giving back constantly, whether it be discounts for rescue work and pop-ups, whatever it is that they're doing to try to give back to the community that's been, patronizing them for so long. Right. How are you seeing the opportunity to give back change once they've actually gone through and sold their practice or retired from the practice? How can they stay engaged in the industry and in the future of veterinary medicine?
Well, I think that's what's so great about having someone who can manage your finances with you, because I think a lot of times when people sell, they don't have that, right? And so if you know how to structure your money, then I think that's the best thing you can do is give back. So what we're seeing is, like you said, we're seeing people give to their schools, to their communities, to their employees. So it's all over the board.
Yeah, in my mind, like one of the solutions in best case with all the cyclicality and all the run up in prices and corporate consolidation in 2021 and 2022, it would be amazing if some of that could get transferred back into the education, right? So that they could potentially help to get more students, attract more talent, and alleviate some of these issues we have on the supply side. In theory, it sounds
exactly. So everybody give to UJ. That's right. We'll glad to take your money, and especially my program that teaches people how to generate as well as own one day.
Well, to Travis's detriment, we started with the dogs. We brought it back to the dogs at the end. I love it. Travis, why don't you wrap us up?
I'm just glad you didn't try to plug giving Kirby any more money. Make the dogs better. I think he's got to know.
Kirby, if you're listening, I love you, man. Thank you.
Well, so Jeff, as we're wrapping up, obviously, we really appreciate you taking some time to come in and talk to us. And I think, this is very applicable to you. I go back to one of our first conversations, right? You're always about kind of changing the world. But there's a little quote that hangs in some bathrooms that says, everyone wants to change the world. No one wants to change the toilet paper roll. Do you sneak out of the bathroom without changing an empty toilet paper roll, or do you actually stop and change that roll?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm not sure what the yes is to, but we'll let you off the hook on that one if you can do well with this one. Since yes, you either change or don't change, you just you like toilet paper. What would be your advice to veterinarians or the veterinary community that wants to create or lead change in the coming years?
There's a good quote that says, people who lose their way lost their why. And I think that the biggest point you have to get back to is, why are you in the profession? And getting back to that time when you accepted you got your letter from the veterinary school of your choice, and that fire, that excitement you have to bring back to the practice and get out of the path of least resistance type of medicine or reactive medicine and be more intentional about what you do. I find that when practices are more intentional, they're happier places to work.
I love that answer so much. Because it's so real. It's just the realities in all the chaos of managing and running a practice and dealing with patients. And we all know how stressful it is inside of the practices today with the demand. To have that perspective, to step back and just remember, why are we doing this in the first place? Hopefully that can get some people through some tough times and focus on the big picture, which is amazing. So this has been great. Jeff, thanks for coming on and spending some time with us. Our guest today, again, Jeff Sanford over at UGA, James Yost, Travis York with the Vet Worthwhile podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
And delete the toilet paper one.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Vet Worthwhile podcast. You can find us online at signaturefd.com/signature veterinary. And then our ask would be, if you found this episode valuable, just think of one friend or colleague that you think would enjoy the content, and just please share. So thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Travis York is the owner of 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and a partner of Signature FD. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors is a veterinary consulting and strategic planning firm of which Signature FD has no involvement or ownership. James Yost is a partner and wealth advisor at Signature FD. Signature FD is an investment advisor registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. 3-in-1 Vet Advisors and Signature FD are not affiliated. Mr. York provides all non-investment advisory services through 3-in-1 Vet Advisors. The opinions of the guests and the contents of this podcast are intended to be educational only and should not be relied upon as investment, tax, business, or planning advice. You should consult with a professional advisor prior to taking any course of action that may impact you or your business.